There we go. Okay, so welcome everyone to the August 2022 Microsoft 365 Modern Management Meetup. My name's Mike O'Shea, and you can find me on Twitter at InTunedIn. And Steve's here today.
Yay! This guy.
We don't have a Ben.
No.
Are we allowed to say? Or I was about to say, are we allowed to share that personally identifiable information about Ben?
Yes, it's Ben's birthday today.
Yeah.
Make sure you tweet at him.
Yeah.
At powers_L.
Okay, and I'll keep in the bit, especially where you say to keep it in.
I'm good with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, we don't have a big group of people on today, so probably won't be a too lengthy a session. But just a couple of things that we'll cover off today. I just wanted to go through some things around Entra and Purview based on conversations I've been having recently, based on weird feedback or misinterpretation of facts that have been presented. Might be a nice way of putting it, especially with Entra. That's one where I think it's like we've probably all spoken to somebody who has said something along the lines of, so does Entra replace Azure AD? So, so I'm sure at least a few of you have heard a variation of that, or you saw the announcement, you're going, hang on, what does that mean for Azure AD? So we'll spend a bit of time like just sort of talking about that and some of the things, that make it different, where Azure AD fits in. And then we'll jump into Purview. Now, there's one particular reason why we're talking about Purview in here. Now, I think the last time we mentioned anything at all around compliance was when we had Macca on a year or two, probably 2 years ago now. Or if I'm saying 2 years, it was probably 3 years. No, it couldn't have been 3 years ago.
It was when we were online, so
yeah, it was online.
Last 2 years.
Yeah. So with Purview, there's a particular reason why, even if you've been avoiding stuff around governance and compliance in the past, because even if you're working on the security team, you might have the I handle security, not compliance. Compliance is something that people who like reading books and filling out forms like working with. But there are some pieces now that are something that we've got to think a little bit more closely about in terms of like managing devices and keeping them not compliance as in device compliance, but data compliance is something that the story has shifted there a bit as well. Then the final thing is just to sort of make sure that we've got enough time at the end to go through and have random usual general discussions at the end. Now, depending on if you've got things that you're happy to have recorded, ask them early in that time frame. Otherwise, if it's something where you'd rather ask after we hit the stop recording button, we can do it then.
Good.
So I guess just the first thing, I'm being harassed by my neighbour's cat who wants to be let outside.
Not your cat anymore?
Not my cat. This is my neighbour's cat.
Oh, so it's
actually not my
actually
cat that's meowing. It's my neighbour's cat who was also in the house. So I need to go and let that cat out while keeping the other cat in. So I guess just in that time frame, if anyone just wants to do a quick introduction, anyone who's new or hasn't made an appearance for a while, just drop a comment into chat and I'll be back in a second.
Sounds like a security challenge, Mark, but who's allowed to get in the entrance and who's not allowed to get in the entrance?
Definitely, we've lowered the bar there for you, Phil. We've let you in.
Has he got a verified ID, that cat?
I think you do. Although I think my cat's trying to get into my office now. So, anybody want to introduce themselves, or we all know each other here? Wow, lively bunch today.
Okay, problem hopefully solved until the other cat starts complaining that it's outside and wants to come inside.
That's okay. We'll get that sorted out, and we'll get that on the recording too. So it looks like everybody's pretty comfortable and they know each other. So I'm happy to. I think we just move on, Mark.
Okay, easy. Okay, so Entra, what is it? So
I think the bigger conversation is what isn't it?
Correct. So Entra is not a rebranding of Azure AD. It's a bigger picture identity view that includes Azure AD. Now, I've got to, before we sort of get into the specifics of, what Entra actually is, I guess it's probably important just to sort of talk about like Azure AD itself. And this is something that I've experienced with a few conversations where if someone's coming into the Microsoft identity world and they've been using AWS or something, or other third-party offerings, it gets really confusing for them when the answer to every identity question is Azure AD. So if someone says, oh, I want to build websites that integrate with Microsoft Identity, and it's like Azure AD, or I want to do, B2C, and it's like Azure AD. So, and Azure AD ends up becoming the answer to everything, which is great in terms of being able to get at least a partially correct answer, even if you don't know the full details. But it's problematic when somebody only knows a small amount about Azure AD and they're not even considering like Microsoft Identity solutions, because it's like, oh no, Azure AD is the thing that Office 365 uses. They don't realize that it's all of these other things. So as much as those of us who sort of live in that world can go, oh no, you've got this component handles that, the overall Azure AD brand makes, it makes it easy to have this type of conversation. But once we get into Entra, then, I guess the other thing that we need to think about here is, if you think about what was good about the Azure AD naming for Microsoft's identity story. Now, I'm not going to say that everyone on the call is old enough that this is probably correct, but I'm going to say that at least a few of you, and no, I'm not calling out Phil, because I know Phil's probably the only person on here who's older than me. There's no age discrimination here, Phil.
Ageism. We're an inclusive bunch here, Mark.
Yeah. So Phil, if I had hair, I would like it to have the grey highlights that yours does. How's that for a comment? How's that for a compliment?
That's a great compliment, particularly now. Look at the grey highlights I got here, mate.
Oh, I think I can probably outgrey you.
You've done a good job on that. Yeah, I can see it down there. You've definitely got that Benedict Cumberbatch, Doctor Strange look about you.
Oh, excellent. So I'm a wizard.
Yes.
I've been called much worse. Okay, so the thing, and I'm glad that Kwok is on this call, because Kwok was in some training probably, I'm guessing it was probably 5, maybe 6 years ago now. And this was, so Kwok, this was the training in the, I think that
I remember it clearly, mate.
The PFE training.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the reason why that training really sticks out to me, apart from you being there, was that it was the first time that I think I'd run EMS training where most of the people in the room had absolutely no AD experience.
Yep.
So all of these things where you sort of just assume that people know a little bit about AD. Yeah. So we basically had it was almost like a room full of people who'd come from the telco side, who knew MDM from third-party MDM solutions and non-Windows operating systems. And in terms of like desktop OS, most of them were probably, were way more familiar with Mac OS than Windows. So it was kind of just a completely non-Microsoft audience. So if you think about the goodwill that Microsoft has with the Azure AD name, having AD in there, that goodwill only works for those of us who are old enough to go, yeah, this makes sense. Leveraging a strong brand that had, high, or still has high penetration in organizations that still have an on-prem directory. But
I only think of it as JetBlue. Just putting it out there.
Yeah. Whereas now, though, if you think about who's coming into this space, and if we're talking about, broader identity conversations, there's already a generation in play in IT who have never touched AD and are never going to touch AD. And they might even look at the Azure AD brand and go, so if this thing is just an extension of the on-prem thing, like, is that really what we want to be using? So even though I don't think that's the kind of thing you'll ever really see publicly discussed about, the Entra brand, at least with Entra, it's like a reset where if someone's got a negative or even a nil association with AD or Azure AD, it's kind of like the opportunity to reset the conversation and turn it into something where we can talk about different things, where obviously Azure AD is probably going to be the big one for most of what we do. But there's definitely a few things in here that, especially with the permissions management, that I think are going to have a pretty quick impact on orgs that choose to roll it out. Now, we'll talk about it in a bit more detail over the next few slides. Now, with verified ID, I think this one is going to take, I think this one is just more of a longer term play in terms of, your personal identity and being able to take it from location to location. That is something that, if you sort of think about what our roles are, there has to be a lot of other things going on outside of what we do for verified ID to be something that really takes off. But the permissions management stuff, that is something that we could probably all benefit from sooner rather than later. Now, anything that you want to add there on the branding side? I guess I'll just sort of open it up to anyone.
No, you're spot on, Mark. Yeah, the whole Active Directory was more, back in the days, everything was hybrid, right? Whereas now, I think as things have matured, it's all cloud native. It's time
hybrid's a dirty word now.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So
yeah,
it's time to go get that Latin dictionary out and finding words that align to it.
After we finish up, I will share a deep bit of wisdom I had with Steve prior to the session starting around the pronunciation of a certain word based on your origin story. You can tell by Steve's reaction that he's going, this is probably not a good idea, but hang around.
No, not while it's being recorded.
Oh, no, definitely not while it's being recorded. So I guess then just the takeaway here is that for people who need to know Azure AD, Entra doesn't necessarily need to be a part of their conversation for them, at least not yet. Over time, I guess what you'll probably, what we can sort of see here is that, we've got three things in here to begin with. What that means is that over time, let's just assume based on prior history with Microsoft, there will be other technologies that Microsoft builds themselves or other acquisitions that they make where this is something that sort of starts to fill out in terms of what's actually in there. But for now, the Azure AD story doesn't really change. These are things that extend what we can do with Azure AD, but I think it's a smart move to start not having Azure AD be the be all and end all of any and every Microsoft identity conversation.
Well, the other part of it is if we sit there and say everything's Azure AD, having the conversation with app devs and go and use AAD for your auth, they sit there and go, but that's our corporate authentication. We need to have a separate tenant for that, and it gets really messy really quickly, and that's the other side of it as well.
So all up, no, Azure AD is not being rebranded. Now, where things do get interesting with this is the permissions management. Now, I'll get someone else to chip in here. How do you pronounce this abbreviation? And how do you differentiate it from what you would call Sentinel? So is it a hard C or a soft C? Can you see any confusion that's going to be generated?
Oh, yeah.
Only confusions when people have accents.
So I think what we need to do to separate them, this one is now officially Keen.
Keen, yes.
Keen with an M. Keen.
Keen.
So this one, it's not a brand new term. It's been around for a while, but it's just one that I guess just hasn't really been part of general Microsoft conversations. But Microsoft bought CloudNox, and basically this is the technology that it's being built around. And right now, when you jump in, you can sign up for a 90-day trial, and you can see that it's like a lot of other Microsoft acquisitions. The portal that you land in makes no effort to hide whatsoever that you are going to a CloudNox environment. And that's, I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing. It's just a thing. I think we all know that it takes a long time to go through and refactor everything and move it and make it part of Microsoft. Even like all we have to do is take a look at cloud app security. Did you just have a cat walk in front of you then, Steve? Was it your turn? Okay,
it was my turn.
Yeah, now there's another
she wants
human
out of the room.
Yeah, there's another human here now, so cat number 1 is being distracted. So if we take a look at what it is, it's effectively going through and analyzing permissions across your different cloud environments and seeing who's doing what, and then giving recommendations to start locking things down. And really, if we take a quick look at it, I think it's, is the wording's, I thought I had the wording in here somewhere. Oh, there we go. Yeah. So effectively here, it's trying to push you towards least privilege. And not just doing it across like Azure AD roles, for example, or going across Azure RBAC roles, but going across AWS and Google Cloud as well. So I guess the positive here, like if just at a simple layer, like ignoring, yes, it's going to increase, security, reduce risk, etc. The other big thing for me with this is a concern that I always have when you've got an organization that is saying, we deliberately want to be multi-cloud because we don't want to be tied into one vendor, and we want to take advantage of the best that every one of those cloud vendors has. The problem that I've always got with those, it's not strictly security related, but security falls into it, is like most people have trouble figuring out how Azure works or what they should be doing in AWS or GCP, yet alone throwing somebody in and saying, you've got to deploy or manage or maintain random things across all 3 cloud environments.
That's okay, Mark. I'm going to use Terraform. It'll do it, and it'll just create it once and deploy everywhere, right?
Yeah. So Terraform. So you're going to use Terraform, not Bicep. So yeah, and even So with this, it's providing another layer over the top, and even here the AWS and GCP integration pieces really tie into that final bit around the Defender for Cloud integration, because the Defender for Cloud team probably for the last year or so have been pushing leveraging Defender for Cloud, not Defender for Cloud Apps, as the way to go through and start, getting that centralized, security posture stance across the different cloud environments. So this is something that effectively will, starts to tie into that. But really here, I think it's one of those things where you kind of know that in a lot of environments, it's going to be situations where, like even if you look at Azure, just like Azure roles, like people who've got permissions at a subscription level or the top management group layer, as opposed to the resource group or potentially the resource that you should be accessing. So we're not even talking about what level of permissions they've got or what permissions they've got. We're talking about the level at which they've got those permissions. So I think anything that starts pushing people in the right direction here is, I don't think you can really fault what the idea is behind this. And one of the things that I think kind of helps this be an add-on to Azure AD, as opposed to something people should expect Azure AD to do included for free, is the fact that it's going across Azure, AWS, and GCP. To me, that just means that I think the conversation around why is this something that we have to purchase separately, for me, that kind of makes that conversation a bit, it makes it a much more palatable conversation. It's like, oh no, this is something quite different. It's not just, Azure recommendations. This is something that's, much more, integrated view across the different cloud environments that you've got. Now, I mentioned that you can get access to a 90-day trial for this. So I just want to quickly jump in and show you over here. Now, it's been sitting on that screen for a bit too long. I don't know why. But if we just jump over here, you've got entra.microsoft.com. Now, one of the things we can do in this new portal is we can get access to a lot. I haven't sort of looked at it to go basically to map off exactly what can you or can't you do in here. But just sort of looking at it, like I'm kind of seeing that it doesn't look like, I know there's apps are in there. So yeah, enterprise apps, app registrations. If you jump into the protect and secure, you'll see conditional access, etc. So just at a quick glance, it looks like it's doing a pretty good job of bringing in what is currently exposed through the Azure AD portal. But as soon as you start clicking around in it, there's no hiding the fact that they're just rendering what's coming in from the Azure AD portal. So right now, what's the value of this? Maybe you just prefer this flatter structure rather than, hang on, how do I get to conditional access? I have to go to Azure AD, then I've got to go to security, then I've got to jump to conditional access. At least here, I guess we can sort of, probably on the navigation side, maybe that's it for now in terms of what the benefit of this this user interface is. But down here with permissions management, this is where you can see up here, like even though yes, it's signing in using Azure AD, just like take a look at the Keem.cloudnox.io. I don't feel right if I know I probably should call it seam, but maybe we need to find out if the C has got one of those characters above it or not. That might make it a bit easier. But in here though, you can sort of see straight away that basically for the data collectors, configuring them for AWS, Azure, GCP, going through, and basically once it's had the ability to go through and start collecting that data, you'll start seeing the different recommendations. So what are the remediations that you need to make? Now, I think something up here is going to have to change because they've got something up here called autopilot. Now, yes, it does not say Windows autopilot, so there's no way that people would ever confuse the two of them. But this is something that obviously the sooner that they can get more of this integrated directly into the Defender for Cloud blades in Azure, probably the easier it's going to be and the more Microsoft-like it will be, as opposed to obviously being something that just doesn't really fit it's not the Microsoft design aesthetic here. But these things take time, but this is one that hopefully we don't see it take too long. Now, I guess in their defense, if they do take a long time period, you could probably spin that as a positive by saying, oh no, we don't want you to feel like you have to use Azure for everything. We can keep you in this environment so that somebody who doesn't really use the Azure portal doesn't have to sign into the Azure portal for that. But obviously, at some point in time, it all at least the reporting needs to be completely exposed through on the Azure side. So I'm too scared to run this one just yet. Or I'll run it after the session. I didn't want to see what results it would give me and have them pop up on screen here. I'm pretty sure that there are going to be a lot of recommendations saying, why do you have 72 global admins in here? No, there are definitely not 72 global admins. So
yes, every executive leader wanted to access.
Yes, fail over. We lose a lot of people really quickly. Okay, now the second part then, now I guess just before we move in and talk about verified ID, has anyone had a look yet at permissions management, or like most of us, how many of you have just said, oh, I'll look at it at some point in the future when it's something that I need to know?
I think it's the need to know scenario there, Mark.
Yeah.
Just my gut feel.
Yeah. Okay. Now with verified ID, I think this is officially the first time I've said blockchain. Apart from saying it to Steve prior to the session, but there's no evidence that actually occurred. So verified ID is something that Microsoft started to at least so August 2020 at least, maybe earlier than that was when Microsoft started promoting this. And this is something that when you sort of go through, take a look at some of the, jump onto Microsoft Mechanics, there's a couple of short videos that will go through it. But it's something that if you watch it, it makes a lot of sense in terms of a way to have your credentials that you're in control of, and you provide just enough of those credentials to other entities that you want to engage with. And I guess the scenario that we're probably talking about related to what we're looking at here is, what about if you're moving over to a new employer, for example, what are all of the bits of think of all the information on the form, whether they're physical or digital forms that you need to fill out. Think of all the repetitive information that you have had to provide over and over again, whether it's going from one employer to another or just in day-to-day life. So the idea here is that you're controlling that information, and you can provide what's required to whoever it is that's requesting it, but you actually get to decide what it is you want to share, when it's going to be shared, who you're sharing it with, and then probably the really big part here is making it really easy for you to go through and actually start revoking that information when you basically, so that you've almost got a rather than it being right to be forgotten like GDPR, where you have to sort of work with that organization to get them to forget you. In this case, you're revoking you're revoking that information. Now, the area where they think that this, things like this in a corporate environment where it really makes a lot of sense, and the scenarios you'll see over and over again tend to be around employee onboarding. So, things like, proof of ID, bank account details for getting paid, your tax file number, all that, all of those things that, you don't need to use them that often, but when you need them, you just want it to be convenient. So I think this is something that looks like it's like something that is going to be quite useful, but in terms of timeframes, like there are a lot of moving pieces here in terms of the organizations that you want to work with on this before they start adopting it. Like imagine, like I'm not throwing banks under the bus, for example, but think of how easy this would make proving who you are if you're signing up for a new bank account, as opposed to the bank saying, oh, we need you to photocopy this and then fax a copy of it through to us as proof of who you are, etc.
Or go into our branch.
Yeah. During the limited hours. Oh, and by the way, we closed all the branches within 5 kilometers of where you are. True story.
I have 2 branches of my bank within 3 blocks of where I live.
Both of them are going to close within 3 years.
Yes.
But they'll put an ATM in about 5 kilometers away and
Correct.
reward you by letting you get free withdrawals, even though it's not branded by your bank.
Correct.
Okay, that is the Australian banking system in a nutshell for those of you not in Australia. So this is something where there are a lot of really good things that you could sort of see the potential for this. You could also potentially see a lot of people who have, I don't want to say tinfoil hat, but I'll say tinfoil hat, going, well, this, is this effectively going to be like a government ID card with too much information, etc. on it? But the idea here is it's not the government that controls this data, it's the individual. So obviously there'll have to be people who build the appropriate apps to allow the sharing, etc. But for me, this really seems like I don't know about other people's views, but for me, this really seems like it's at least a 3 to 5 year before we see any major impact. Like apart from the novelty of some organizations signing up early and saying, yep, let it rip, we're good to go. But I see that being more outliers than the entities that we prefer to have this functionality with. So with this one, has anyone looked at this at all previously? Even because you saw a video and thought, oh, what's that?
I had a look at it briefly. I do have a bit of a tinfoil view about it.
Yeah, so so do you agree that you can sort of see a lot of potential for it?
I can see that it will prove things like you can go to an event and you can say, I was at that event. You can actually prove that you were at that event. Because somebody else, fundamentally, when it comes to identity, somebody else still needs to verify. So even if we go through the process of saying, well, these are my credentials, somebody still needs to look at other factors that make it yours.
Yeah.
And then the question I have is, okay, so even how do you change your credentials?
Yeah, so
there's a lot I don't know just yet.
Yeah, And so the stuff that I've been seeing so far about it, it's like, they're talking about how you control who does, who gets what, etc. And you'll sort of hear generic things like through an app. And it's like, okay, well, what's the app? Who's building the app? What trust level do I have in the people who are making that app? So so I'm with you on that side. It's like, okay, there's like more details to be fleshed out. But even like when you sort of think about like going back to a government example, like having centralized accounts with like Australian government or New South Wales government or whatever makes a lot of things a lot easier, especially over the last few years where it's like, I've got to do, get this stuff for COVID vaccinations. I'm traveling. I've got to get all of this other data. So we can sort of see the benefit. We've already sort of seen ways that, even dealing with governments in the limited way they put in some of this stuff in place, there's already huge benefits there that this just opens it up a lot more broadly when it comes to, what other random, or not random in a bad way, but other organizations that sign up for this. So hopefully,
but the difference, the big difference though, is that the governments are the ones that are issuing that information. So the government ID, they are then verifying that yes, this is what they issued to you. Whereas Microsoft creating an ID is you just putting in whatever information you want to share.
Yeah.
But Microsoft's not going to verify that that's correct. Like you could just put anything in. So how do you then get the issuing authority to verify that yes, what you've put in there and what you are sharing is actually real?
Yeah, so that's why I say this will have a countersign. So I will say my name is Dean, and Microsoft doesn't care whether it is or isn't Dean, but I need somebody else to have a look at my birth certificate and say, yes, that's Dean. So when I then go and present those credentials somewhere else and say I'm Dean, the person who sees that it hasn't not been tampered with, and B, that it was agreed by a trusted party that they approve that my name is Dean. So it's just a secure ID transport mechanism as opposed to an actual ID as such.
Yeah. So the actual issuing authorities would have to be
approved on the chain. Yeah, correct.
Right.
Yeah. So the same way.
Actually, that's going to be complicated. But I guess as issuers sign on to it, then more and more information becomes available if you wish to share it. Oh my God, this is going to be a PII mine for hackers, isn't it?
Well, you say that though. I mean, like I've given this some thought, and this is an open platform. Firstly, so the blockchain is open, which means that you can have a registered identity. Let's say, for the sake of argument, the Australian government, they have an identity that says, well, anything that's signed on the chain for these identities has been approved. So when Scott says he's Scott, or when Dean says he's Dean, and it's countersigned on the chain by that organization, then we know that that is a legitimate identity. But the ID and the content itself does not stay on the chain. It's the signature of that stays on the chain, as far as I understand.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so, I mean, I guess there's a lot to understand. And the same thing would be like with expiring documents as well. So then you've got
I've thought about that too.
Do you have to update them, or is it going to be automatically like linked to the updated version or something? Like, do you have to keep on updating your credit card expiry date all the time, or will it link to the whatever active version of it is?
Yeah, I haven't seen anything that really. I'm sure there's probably some good documentation around it, but I haven't sort of looked into it that deeply yet.
It's an interesting technology, and as much of it as I do about Bitcoin. So
okay, so
that's why I'm poor.
So let's jump into the next one. So the goal here isn't to talk about Purview too broadly.
What's in the Purview for Purview?
I have to stop spelling it with 2 R's. I do that deliberately to annoy people, and I know that I'm going to accidentally do it somewhere where I should not do it. So So probably so really here, this was just to talk about Purview in particular, because it's something that on the device, like if we sort of think more about, the device management side in general, guidance came out late last month around Windows information protection. Let me use the correct term, being functionality being sunsetted. So rather than saying retired over time, or even they didn't use the word deprecated, because that suggests that it would still work even years after it's not supported. So basically Windows information protection, which I think any of you who have tried to deploy it in production or tried getting it working in general, it wasn't something that you ever really got somebody walk away from the experience saying, I'm so glad I invested that time in that project.
I'm curious, just a quick show of hands or come off mute, how many people have actually leveraged Windows information protection or attempted to?
Never in production. What a horrendous beast.
Yeah.
That's all I can say.
Yep. That's all I can say while the recording's going as well.
Yep. No, let it die sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and look, it's one of those things where I think even if you look at the history of it, how like enterprise data protection was supposed to be part of Win 10 when it shipped and just kept getting pushed back, and then it gets rebranded, and then suddenly the feature or the feature set has changed a bit and it's now Windows information protection. And no, it is not MAM for Windows.
But it is, because it sits under the same area.
Yeah.
When I go and select MAM, it says Windows,
and
then you go and enable it. And anyway,
yeah,
I'm not going to say much else.
Suddenly you got a screen full of briefcases.
Yeah.
Suddenly you just got flipping stupid little padlocks and briefcases everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, horrendous.
And they appear occasionally instead of OneDrive sync icons, if you're lucky. So with this one, I don't think anyone is I didn't see anyone. Actually, I think this is the first time I've seen Microsoft say we're discontinuing something without somebody in a comment saying this is the worst thing Microsoft has ever done. I think this is the first time I have not seen that comment anywhere. Like you name a random thing that Microsoft has discontinued, and there's always somebody saying like
Zoom.
Let me use an example. Okay, you win with Zoom. I was about to say Windows Phone. Whereas, people go, discontinuing Windows Phone was the dumbest thing Microsoft ever did. And it's like, oh, no. As a company, they have done many, many dumber things over the years. That's just one that you happen to have been impacted by. So here it's something that, like moving across to Purview, I guess the thing that I think that is something that you'll see in the announcement that you can't avoid what they're telling you there, which is that if you do want to start working with Purview for DLP and for information protection, like you need to jump in and learn like how to Purview, like how do you create your data loss prevention policies? How do you start becoming familiar with the alerts and notifications, etc. through it? So for any of you who knew that you had to do some kind of data loss prevention, and maybe Windows information protection was the thing sitting in the back of your mind as something that may have been an answer. I guess like for me, the thing that I guess that I don't like about this, like I understand it, it's being thrown into, it's basically being forced to use Purview, whereas normally I try to stay out of conversations around compliance and governance. It's like, oh no, they're special people. In a lot of cases, it's like, non-technical conversations. It's people and process in a lot of cases.
Yep.
Whereas now all of a sudden, you have to start engaging more with those people, and your response will be, can I just turn the thing on? And they're like, oh no, we need to review it for another 6 months.
I've had it in audit mode for the last 6 months.
Yes.
You've had what? Oh.
Yeah, that's why nothing has been prevented. So yeah, so I didn't really want to do like a deep dive into Purview. It's probably something that we probably should have a closer look at how this actually works as a bit more of a farewell, or not a farewell, a waving to whip as it sails into the sunset. Yeah, so we probably should have a look at this a little bit in a bit more detail later on, but I just wanted to sort of cover off a few of the things that have changed over the last few years since we did get Macca in to go through that session. Now, probably one of the things that I want to talk about quickly that hasn't changed from that time frame is something that that was Andrew was mentioning back in that session, was that if you're updating policies, that the result of those policy updates need to be distributed through Microsoft infrastructure before they end up on your endpoints. So it's not something where it's instantaneous, where you push a button and the client device instantly or very, very shortly will pick those settings up. It's the usual, it's how long will it take? It'll take X number of cloud units for it to occur. So I guess that's probably just like one of the things that I wanted to call out here that isn't, hasn't changed, that, basically stuff needs to replicate, and basically, not all clients are going to be pointing to the same Microsoft endpoints to get these updates. So basically things are going to potentially be staggered in terms of how they get deployed. Now, two things that I wanted to cover off, just to sort of talk about some of the things that are either new or not necessarily new, but just things that have changed over the last few years since we last spoke about like, it wasn't even Purview at the time. It was just Microsoft Compliance Center, basically. So probably the first one here is just that now Mac OS is supported as a client-side OS as well, and just like with the on the Windows side, the onboarding process is effectively the same process you'd be going through if you were onboarding for Defender for Endpoint. Now, one of the things that did change over the life cycle, and I think it was something that was only in preview of the Endpoint DLP, was I think during preview, you had to have Defender for Endpoint licensing for Endpoint DLP to work. But I think that was just a preview thing. That restriction has lifted. In order for it to work, though, you still need to have like a fairly current version of like Microsoft's anti-malware engine down on basically the Defender engine down on the client. It doesn't need to be Defender for Endpoint. It just needs to be Defender to go through and do that onboarding. But over here, like, no surprise, you look at this, it instantly looks like, or if you're familiar with the Defender for Endpoint onboarding, you look at this and it's just a variation of a theme in terms of what you're getting in there. And then the instructions are just pointing you out straight out to the Defender for Endpoint documentation to actually go through and do that onboarding. Now, just a couple of slides then on some of the things that the DLP support for macOS doesn't have versus what the Windows version includes. So at the moment, the Windows capabilities are a superset in terms of the DLP settings. So if we just sort of have a quick look through here, rather than talking about everything there, we can just sort of switch out quickly and have a look, just so that we're not staring at
slides.
What do we want? Staring at PowerPoint the whole time. But just here, like in, I've got to stop calling this Compliance Manager. It's not Compliance Manager, it is Microsoft Purview. Yeah, things that are going to take a long time to get used to. At least now I do call security.microsoft.com. At least I do call that the M365 Defender portal now. So I'm getting one of them right. So this is where we go through and do the configuration. And you can see in some cases we've got different options for file path exclusions for Mac versus Windows, because obviously they are going to be quite different to each other. But then you can see that this is really where we go through and start putting some of those settings in place. So this is where we go through and choose what are the settings that we want to have applied here. Now, important things to note when we take a look at the DLP settings here is that the settings that we're applying are like, we don't have the ability to create different groups of endpoint DLP settings for targeting different groups of devices or different groups of users. Like if you're kind of used to the Teams terminology, where if you see something that says settings, it means you're configuring this for the tenant, and policies allow you to do targeting of certain functionality. Pretty much we're seeing something quite similar in here. Now, the other thing, I guess, just to talk about quickly here is that, over here they've got Activity Explorer. Now, there's probably not going to be any real activity over here because nothing is actually, there is. And the reason is because I realized in order to get some activity in, what I did was I turned on always audit file activity for devices just to get some data in. So normally it's going to go through and just look for certain pattern matches, etc., looking for the data that you are trying to protect. But I just turned it on and said, look, anytime there's an Office file, a PDF or a CSV file, automatically get some data in here. So at least that way I get some activity in here, and I'll click, okay, yeah, there's nothing bad appearing in there. So you can sort of see, in this case, what location, on-premises SharePoint?
But it's SharePoint.com, so that's incorrect. But
yeah, I wonder because it's happening down on the client side that it determines, because it's on the client, it says, oh, that's on-prem SharePoint. Let's accept that as valid, and
yes.
Yeah. Now
we don't know enough to be able to review you on that, so we're going to go with that.
Yeah, so we'll just accept that. Now, the other thing is over here is how do we go through and then start targeting devices? I'll just quickly go through this one. So just creating just a standard DLP policy. Look at that. Australia is at the top of the list because because of importance, not because of alphabetical order. And of course, we rename everything and make it more useful. Now I'll turn everything else off, but just to show down here, now here, they might need to update the icon because it's only showing Windows. But it says devices, so maybe they need to put in something that represents a non-Windows device or a generic device in there. But otherwise, we just go and we can turn it on from there. What's the data that we want? So notice here that even though I'm specifying I only wanted to apply to, basically, this is me saying it's endpoint protection, or not endpoint protection, endpoint or endpoint DLP that I'm applying here, that it's not really asking anything about, nothing here that you'll see is specific to the device side of things. Because anything device related is in that settings area rather than in policy. So we can just sort of keep going through that, and there's like other stuff on here. Now, if you haven't looked at some of the stuff around sensitivity labels and DLP, etc., over in Purview, if you think about some of the things that you may have tried to achieve with Windows information protection around blocking certain types of data, etc., effectively, this really is the natural replacement for information protection. And rather than trying to sort of implement two different things to provide part of the solution, this is what's going to provide all of it. Now,
almost all of it.
Almost all of it. Yeah.
So the other part that you can look at, and this is doing the left turn and completely throwing Mark off his spiel, but the other solution that you can look at in the Defender stack to go with this is the removable media controls. Yeah. Where you stop data being written to USB devices and mobile phones and external devices in general. So this is to stop you from copying it into, as you can see, web-based solutions. And then if you're wanting the additional controls on the client side, you can do that for printing and USB media with the Defender removable media controls and printer controls, which are configured in the MEM portal.
Yeah. But they're Defender for Endpoint settings, aren't they? It's Defender for Endpoint that's doing the enforcement. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And I guess the reality is that now I know there are definitely going to be some orgs that mix and match the different security and compliance components from different vendors, but it's there is that. It's not necessarily an underlying assumption that you're using Defender for Endpoint, but Defender for Endpoint definitely is going to be required, or something like Defender for Endpoint.
So the thing to note with the removable media controls. So long as you have an E3 license, you don't technically need to have Defender enabled. So if you're using a third-party AV product, so long as the AV defs are being updated, you can actually connect to it. It's interesting that we call it out as Plan 2 there, because Plan 2 is only required if you're sending the data up for reporting. Plan 1 will work just to configure it.
Yeah, because it's because here, just jumping down to the custom setting or custom policy down there.
So yeah, and if you go into the portal under attack surface reduction, there's actually an option to configure a lot of this now.
Oh, okay. Okay, so let's just go back. So from here, so I guess on the Mac side, I don't pay enough attention to the Mac side to sort of either be curious, I guess just interested in, at least I haven't had to yet to sort of see, are these unsupported settings things that are in the pipeline? Are they things that are OS related? So basically, is it leveraging for OS functionality that potentially that's not there, or maybe that Defender's not, or that that's not being supported there? But I'm sure if you did a bit of digging into docs or into tech community, you'd probably find reasoning behind that in there. Now, just the second part where I just wanted to do a quick comparison, again from the Mac versus Windows. So on this side, the two things that aren't supported in terms of auditing or managing down here. So copying into an RDP session or copying across via Bluetooth. So they're not things we can really control if we were trying to do it on the Mac OS side. But here you can start seeing some of the media control stuff that Steve was just mentioning in here as well. Now, the other thing that was added in, and I've thrown this one in here because somebody thought this was something completely different to what it was. And it was the new name or the current name, and it's been this name for a while, the Purview extension for Chrome. So I think that gives you a pretty good idea that it's Purview integration into Chrome. Edge has already got it. We don't need an Edge extension for it. But before, it used to be called the Microsoft Compliance extension. And I had a bunch of people thinking that it was an agent that needed to be installed down on the client. So even here, even if they just called Microsoft Compliance extension for Edge, for Chrome, that would have answered that or addressed that concern. But Purview extension for Chrome, I guess we're getting a double win there in terms of it's got Purview branding in it, and it is telling us that it's actually a Chrome extension. And it will go through and basically start giving us similar capabilities to what we can start seeing, basically what's being built into Edge. Obviously, taking functionality that they're building into Edge and adding it into a Chrome extension. Obviously, they're not going to be able to integrate as deeply into the browser, but they can still go through and get a fair bit of functionality in there. Now, for this one, just a few things around the setup is basically you'll need to follow the instructions to get your ADMX file for for Chrome ingested into Endpoint Manager. There's a custom configuration profile that you'll need to drop in as well. And once again, for this to work, the devices do need to be onboarded. So the extension doesn't work in isolation. We do need to have the device either just going through, if it's been enrolled with Defender for Endpoint, it will light up automatically. Alternatively, going through Purview and doing that enrollment through that portal that I showed briefly earlier. But fairly straightforward. Now, just another thing, seeing that we're sort of still on this whole information protection fading away. Just some of the things that you'll start seeing in here is some of the additional roles and role groups that you'll see that are lighting up in preview for Purview right now. So they've sort of realized that having a big monolithic information protection role isn't really the right approach. They have to get more granularity for larger organizations. So here there's, so obviously, you know, more roles coming through. And the reason why I thought it was important to sort of drop this in here was we've already been speaking about least privilege as part of Entra. And now, I guess if we have to start looking at Purview, then we can probably use the benefit of other people and what they've learned in the past around the different roles, etc. But now we can get a little bit more specific here, so that if we want someone just to be responsible for information protection, we don't need to give them like big, you know, big wide open compliance reader or compliance manager roles, for example. So just a bit more, you know, a bit more granularity, never a bad thing. Yeah, some people will complain that there's too many options and they'll just default back to global admin. But nobody on this call would ever sign in as global admin. Ever. Except in tenants.
It's called non-production and trial
Yes,
tenants.
yes, non-production environment. Yeah, like yes. Anytime I want to do something different, I just jump into PIM and away I go.
Correct.
I could almost say that with a straight face if I tried. No, I couldn't.
Sometimes okay, so I have PIM set up.
Yeah, I know I have it set up, but then I have to remember to remove it because then I'm wondering why something's not where it should be in demo tenants. Okay, so that was really it in terms of just the like quick updates or overviews of Entra and Purview. But I think what we probably need to do in a future session is probably go through like an end-to-end Purview, but yeah, we'll restrict it in terms of just things that impact devices. Like, you know, not going through insider risk management and like, yeah, sure, there's a lot of interesting stuff in Purview, but we don't want to sort of go too far off track. We want to focus on, you know, what's probably, you know, what's the bare minimum you need to know about Purview if you are planning on implementing it for endpoint data protection, endpoint DLP and information protection. I think we could probably, you know, put something together like that pretty easily, and just keep it focused so that, you know, first of all, we don't get too distracted, but also so that it's actually something that's a bit more relevant to most of you. So with that, let's just switch over now to just general conversation topics, etc. So I guess if anyone's got any questions or comments about things that we've already spoken about, or if you've got questions that you're happy to get answered as part of a general discussion, ask them early. But for any of those things that you don't want there being a record and you want to deny all responsibility, we'll still be around for a while after we finish the recording.
I was going to ask whether you think the name changes is potentially diluting the message around a lot of these platforms. I mean, Purview consists of 8 or 9 different components, and you could more or less become an expert in that and have a job for the next 10 years.
Yeah. Look, so my take on that stuff is that having a more generic brand at the top level makes sense in the long term, because you don't have to keep changing the name each time you decide to extend the functionality of, let's say, the suite of offerings underneath it. So even if you look at, so let's use EMS as an example. It was the Enterprise Mobility Suite when it first launched. But then it's like, oh, hang on, we've been adding a bunch of security functionality into it. So we're now going to change it so that it's actually Enterprise Mobility and Security. So I think having more of that generic, let's call it aspirational branding. I don't know if aspirational is the right word, but I'll stick with it. I think it's, as much as we might look at it from the technical side and say, I have no idea of what this thing is based on the name, it's probably not us that they're targeting. the underlying components are going to have the names that make sense to us. I guess the challenge that we'll have, that we'll have with things like this, is if somebody comes up to you and you have to give a yes or no answer. Do you know Purview? There aren't many people who can honestly say yes unless they're absolutely deluded, delusional there. Because someone will go, yeah, I know some of it, but I guess that's the problem when you've got too many things under that one umbrella. But I just sort of, like a few years ago, I probably would have been a bit less open to them. But now, with the benefit of hindsight and seeing where things go wrong, where things need to be rebranded because the name doesn't make sense, the fluffier marketing names do. I think they do have a place.
Yep.
But no doubt, I'm sure at least one of you in the next few months is going to get called into a meeting where you have to talk about Viva and/or Entra and/or Priva, and whoever it is that's organised the meeting and told you what it is they want you to talk about has put the wrong thing in the meeting invite because they didn't know which one it was. That's something that I guarantee it's going to be a common occurrence for a while.
Yeah, I've done a few Purview /DLP whatever you want to call it type of engagements, and the customers are confused about what DLP really is.
Yeah.
They just mix everything together, and they're even more confused now with Purview. So it's going to take a while to explain it to them.
Yeah. Well, even like when you take a look at insider risk management, like you've got insider risk management as a category, and then you've got insider risk as an entry in that category, along with a bunch of other things. So even there you can already see, places where, what we view as something closer to the correct or an accurate name, they can start backfiring pretty quickly.
Yeah.
I've got a question. So with these kind of product offerings, it's like there's already other things out there that Microsoft do, which do some of it, and it's like the automation space where there's 4 or 5 different offerings that do various types of automation, but then they all do it differently. Some of them start adding extra features, and you wish those features were in the other ones, and you don't know which one should I go with because I want that feature. But is this going to be another one of those kind of situations where here's another family or another suite offering, but you have to choose either that one or one of the other offerings if that's what they do?
So let me just see if I can. I've got to remember where we get to this, and anyone who remembers, please drop in a hint. But as you're going through, and I don't think it's in data loss prevention policies. Just let me check in here.
What is it? Sorry, what you looking for?
So the thing that I'm looking. Okay, so it's not in here. I think it's probably when we're going back into sensitivity labels. Let me just cancel out of that. So one of the things that I did like in here, right from when Azure Purview was first being discussed, was when, what is it what we're looking for?
What is it you're looking for?
So
Data
just
classified.
under data classification, and I think, no, that's not what I wanted. Where is it? Is it under policies?
What are you looking for, sir?
Looking for when we go through certain parts of Purview, when we're going through and configuring certain policies, that one of the locations that we get to choose to protect with it will actually show Azure Purview as one of the options.
Yes, it's in a label.
Okay,
you configure it by label. So under information protection labels.
So where are we? There we go. Information protection. Let's do labels. So so in here, if we take a look at, I think if we actually have to give it some junk.
There it is. It's called Schematized Data Assets.
Yeah, so there we go. So in Microsoft Purview data map. So the references to Purview have been in here, probably like over a year now. Potentially a lot longer, or however long ago Purview was first initially being discussed. Then it was something that was showing up in here pretty early as an option. So hopefully, we see that when they are doing things like extending brands or functionality like that, that you don't want to get back to that situation where Microsoft evolved, where you've got different divisions creating products that are going to compete head on with each other and have got fairly different feature sets to each other. Now, I think like when you look at things like in Azure and you look at, or even just without Azure, if you just look at automation, and we've even comparing Power Automate versus Logic apps, what percentage of those would you say is identical? It's a pretty big percentage, but then each of them have got their own unique thing. And the way that I sort of think about the decision to make there is, if I'm living in M365 or if I'm an Azure developer, that would be like probably one of the big ones that would help that decision. But then like once you get into Azure though, like is it something that you can do with a Logic app? Would you be using what else? Basically using Azure automation to automation accounts to perform certain things. Yeah, you get a few options. And I think the toughest thing sometimes is for people to actually pick one, as opposed to sitting there and basically getting stuck because one does something slightly different to the other, but the other one does something else a little bit better. I think sometimes it's just biting the bullet and then paying the consequences down the track.
Because I remember asking you this question at one of the Ignites or something with all the different automation tools. I said, okay, so you've got these enterprise automation, then you've got like these personal automation. Is there a point where they're going to kind of merge together and become a single product? And the answer was they had no idea, or no, there were no plans. Because like you said, there's completely different teams doing it. They're coming at it from different directions because this one's trying to solve this set of problems, this one's trying to solve this set of problems, and there's a huge overlap. So what happens if you've already implemented a lot of protection systems? Do you have to now abandon that and go to this, or is there going to be, like, that's the question, is does Microsoft have a roadmap of unifying all these into a single entity or something or not?
Well, I think with that stuff, like Purview, if we're talking about like governance and compliance, etc., I'd say that, there really shouldn't be any, or at least hopefully there shouldn't be any overlapping technologies in there. I guess that's where things would get quite problematic with something like this. Whereas, like obviously over in Office 365, you could probably, write a never-ending essay on where you've got functionality that overlaps between the different technologies. But here, I think here though it's a matter of, everything that used to be separate is just being pulled in under think of Purview as like the overall umbrella, or even if you just want to think of it as the marketing brand, think of it that the technologies are being pulled under that. But the problem with that approach though is like at this point in time, you could probably say something along the lines of Purview is made up of all of these different components, and it would probably be a fairly accurate statement. But if you think about, if you compare that conversation to Microsoft 365 Defender, during the early days of Microsoft 365 Defender, you could say it's a bundle, it's a suite of things, but now you've got actual, Microsoft 365 Defender native functionality that you get when you've got multiple Defender components. So I think it's probably going to be something similar with Purview, where there'll be, right now it's made up of a lot of individual components, but those individual components aren't going to go away. Instead, it's how they interact with each other is like, that's probably just the story that's going to get a lot better.
Yeah, and better together story.
So sorry, Steve, Karen.
That's right. No, I was just reiterating the better together story, and you buying the suite, not the tool sets.
Yeah, so as I say, I've done a few of these types of deployments, everything spanning DLP and the endpoint through to MCAS. And my most frustrating elements with this is that better together bit. The bits and pieces, the fact that no matter how experienced you are at it, you can easily forget one single checkbox in one platform on one page, and that stops information flowing. And then, you look like a bit of an ass in front of your customer, but the reality is that why doesn't this stuff just flow automatically? Like, there's no penalty for sending Defender for Endpoint Analytics and signals through to MCAS, and there's no penalty for sending all of that information through to compliance. Why do I have to go into the portal and actively check the stupid checkbox? If these things are all going to work together, let them work together. But why, perfect example you got there, the tab for onboarding Windows devices in compliance. Why is that not automatic?
I can give you answers to that stuff. A lot of this isn't designed with anything, or if you sort of think of it in terms of corporate IT silos in large enterprises where everybody has to have control over their particular piece of the puzzle. So even like if we jump into like integration between Defender for Endpoint and Intune, for example, it's like, well, why can't I just do something in one place? And it's like, oh no, because the device admins need to make sure that they want to make sure that they're approving it. But then the endpoint manager admins also the Defender for Endpoint managers also need to approve it. So even just like scroll through the list of advanced features in Defender for Endpoint, and it really highlights that, where it's like, oh, everything is broken out, that there's not just a switch you turn on that says enable everything, because the stuff is being built with the assumption that most of the organizations that are going to be deploying it are going to be so siloed between all these divisions that everyone has to take on the responsibility of enabling that particular piece of the integration. Now,
yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah,
I do get that.
Yeah, but then the flip side of it is if all of that stuff is available and we all have to do it, and Microsoft is releasing things like Microsoft 365 Defender for Business, it's like, well, the stuff that's included with these plans, or based on whether, even if they're just sort of offering it to certain sizes of customers or certain plans, to say just integrate all of the security technologies, and maybe pop up a warning if it's something that's going to generate traffic that might have additional costs or something like that. But then I guess the other part of it as well, and I don't think this is the reason, but it's something that may be worth talking about, is if all of this stuff was enabled by default, what would the impact be on the work of those workloads in Microsoft data centers? So
I guess what I'm saying is that I come to the Purview console, and I say I want endpoint DLP. Boom, turn it on. Don't make me go into the endpoint console, find the setting tab, find the advanced settings, then go into I want to send my signals to this place, and then I have to go into the Purview console and then find the reverse to say that yes, I'm happy to accept those signals. I get it. It's all disconnected. Look, that's just a frustrating bit that makes a person look like a bit of an arse in front of your customer sometimes, right?
Yeah, and it's so easy to miss something, and you're sitting there just getting for me, I'm just so glad now that most of the demo tenants do things like set Intune as the MDM authority by default. The number of times that's been my undoing, because I assumed I didn't even think to enable it. Because
the best one is localization for autopilot demos.
My main customer complaints about this platform is around the inability to scope alerts and information to the data owners. So so when an alert for a particular in large organizations, some of mine have got 40 million files kind of thing. When they get an alert for a DLP action, they want it to be delivered to the team that's responsible for that data. And there's no way to scope this based on on that. So it's just like a million alerts get raised.
Yeah, so yeah, it's almost like I guess hopefully it's something where maybe something like the admin units in Azure AD eventually help to address some of that stuff. But that doesn't really seem to be that just seems to be more of a management direction as opposed to ongoing monitoring. But that's something where even the ability to split it out via region, for example, with your alerts. It's I completely I feel you on that one.
Yeah. What it sounds to me like, Dean, and correct me if I'm wrong, is you're looking for like a quick start page where you can go tick, 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 enable, link it all together, and away we go.
Do you know what, mate? I'll settle for a web page that I can follow step by step. It's all fine and well that you do it the first time around and you say, oh yeah, I know where that is. And then you look away and you come back and it's called something else. It's in a different location. It's got a different button. It is very frustrating. And I get that we're renaming stuff to make things more productized, more showing that they're all together.
Yeah.
But really, if you look at DLP on endpoints, which is huge, like a lot of people are implementing that nowadays.
Yes.
It's Defender.
Yep.
So,
right.
So now is that Defender for Purview? I think there was a joke on Twitter the other day about Office being renamed Defender for Documents and stuff. Yeah. And I said, well, what should
words.
That's right. And Teams should be Defender for communication and chat and stuff.
Yes, and Excel is Defender for numbers.
Numbers. That's right. Yeah. Anyway.
Yes. Look, there's always going to be that period of adjustment with the docs, and this is where we just need to work through that. And what I would say is, if you see things like that where it's not quite right, just put an issue up on the docs, or put a feedback.
The documentation itself is actually quite good. I have no issues with that, but the documentation is siloed, and the product is a whole suite, right?
Yeah. No. Okay. So what you're looking for is an overarching document, then maybe that links them all together, going, this is the run through guide.
Yeah, but let's not make it too easy so that our customers don't just go and roll it out, right?
I hear.
And unfortunately, I know the reason why pages like that don't exist is because nobody from within any one of those teams wants to take the responsibility for it, because it means they might have to learn about somebody else's technology, and they might have to become responsible for making sure that any changes in other people's technologies are reflected in that page. And yes, I know that is an absolutely horrible thing to say about why some of those things don't exist. There's no reason why they shouldn't exist. But it's based on, let's use the word silos again. Instead of documentation silos, we can talk about product team silos, for example.
Don't know what you're talking about there, Mark.
No.
Well, could almost say, why is it that Adam Fowler has the list of all portals, and why doesn't Microsoft have a list of all portals?
Hey.
I can answer that one as well.
Someone's got to take responsibility for keeping the list up to date.
Adam now works for Microsoft, so we now officially.
So now it's officially Microsoft again.
Okay, I don't know if that counts, but all right.
Actually, I haven't chatted to him, but actually no. I was about to say something, but I'll wait till after the recording has stopped.
Yes.
It's nothing bad about anyone. It's just something funny.
So just before we wrap up the recording, I have one question to everybody. Obviously, if you're listening to the recording back, ping us on Twitter, DM, whatever. But for those in the room, if we were to have in person in North Sydney at the Microsoft office, how many people would be interested in joining us there? Cool.
Okay, I'll stop the recording. And we've got a few things that we can pick up on immediately based on a couple of the comments in chat. So let me just
Definitely.
stop